All right, so we're going to talk about the revolutions that sweep Europe in 1848, and they happen everywhere. So these occur in every European country for the most part, except for Great Britain and Russia. So the most advanced, which is Great Britain, and the most backwards, which is Russia, tend to avoid these revolutions, but everywhere else suffers from them. They are the result of this supercharged atmosphere and tension between new political ideas of liberalism and socialism fighting against conservatism. And it's also exacerbated by an economic crisis. It's in part spurred on by this Irish potato famine, but there's a few other global economic reasons as well. And then just the romanticism of the time, and the romantic era calls for spontaneity and glory, and so that's another cause. And so these liberals who rise up in revolt in 1848 demand written constitutions, representative government, and civil liberties. That's what they're wanting. And so we're going to look at three: France, Austria, and Prussia. So first we have France. The French government under the King Louis Philippe, there are many, many, many critiques of it. The first is that they are a corrupt government. That they are just serving their own interests. They are not helping the people. They are not truly liberal. There's also complaints because they don't expand voting rights. Their laws that are being made are not in the interests of the general public or the public good, but rather special interest groups. And so what we see is that in February of 1848, shopkeepers and other middle-class people who were demanding liberal reforms finally have enough and rise up because they're frustrated about being shut out. And so they rise in revolt. And they have... they're drawing on years of history from the French Revolution, and kind of the French Revolution at this point had been over-glorified and is idealized in history. And so these revolutionaries, though, drawing on that, push for a real republic. One of the problems, and this is going to be a problem throughout the revolutions, is the revolutionary groups may unite temporarily to overthrow a king, but they're not to maintain that cohesive coalition. And so you have liberal Republicans in the middle class who want like liberal Republican ideas, and then you have radical Republicans of kind of the lower middle class or even the lower class who had been influenced greatly by these French utopian socialists who talked about the right to work and demands for work. And so there's kind of these problems. And what we see is that there's this battle for these ideas, and in fact, occasionally the socialist idea wins out, and Louis Blanc, one of the famous French socialists, actually gets for a time this right to work law passed that brings a ton of French citizens in and gives them work through the government. And so they work on these huge public works projects. But what ends up happening is there is a election. The more moderates tend to win out. Small groups of socialists win seats, but Republicans, the liberal Republicans, dominate the assembly. The socialists are eventually squashed, but they're frustrated with that. So they rise up with violence. Of course, the moderate liberals respond with even more violence. And at the end of the day, they call for a new election to be held in December of 1848 to resolve these issues. And the result of that election is the new head of France, Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, who sets up his own autocratic regime in France. So looking then to Austria, the revolution in the Austrian Empire begins in Hungary because Hungarians, if you'll recall, they never really were happy with being under Austrian rule. They were a fiercely independent people with different culture, different history, different language, and so they rise up demanding national autonomy. They demand civil liberties, and they demand universal voting rights. The people of Hungary want these things. And so they rise up. And then that is met by people in Vienna rising up to support them. And we see the King of Austria, the Emperor of Austria, really, Ferdinand I, gives in and agrees to these reforms. The problem is that then this Hungarian coalition is never really able to unite, because Hungarians want to create now a unified Hungarian state that is centralized. But within that, there may be a majority of Hungarians, but there's a lot of minorities like Serbians, Croats, and Romanians who all want their own states as well. And this gives Ferdinand his opportunity to exploit the fears of these nationalist groups and play them against each other to keep this coalition weak. But that's still not enough to satisfy the Austrian nobility, who are frustrated with the fact that Ferdinand gave in. So they stage a coup that is supported by the French, or the nobility and the army, the church, and the government, and they put Francis Joseph in power. The Austrian army eventually turns and attacks the rebels in Vienna, the Viennese rebels, and eventually then they turn to their old partner Russia for help to crush the Hungarian revolts, well, not for all, but for this time frame. So what we see again is this pattern where initial success is met by this fracturing coalition and eventually replaced by another authoritarian, totalitarian regime. So yes, you may have a revolt, but you're just replacing one king for another monarch, another dictator. And so then we'll turn to Prussia. And Prussia, before 1848, their goal was to create a constitutional monarchy, and this liberal middle class wanted Prussia to lead and transform this German confederation into a unified Germany. That is their goal. They are inspired by the uprising against Louis Philippe, and they feel like now is the time to strike while the iron is hot. So they demand a constitution. And Frederick William IV, who was the king of Prussia at this time, gave in and said, look, okay, I will give you a liberal constitution and promise you we will merge Prussia into this newfound Germany. So that's all well and good and satisfies this liberal middle class. The problem is that the workers of Prussia are demanding much more in the reform. They want greater democracy. They don't want a liberal constitution with republicanism. They want everyone the right to vote. And there's even some socialist demands coming in there. So while the workers and the middle class may have risen up together in their demands, suddenly they start splitting apart. The middle class meets in Frankfurt to write a constitution. But as they are doing this, war breaks out with Denmark over a few northern provinces in the German states. Prussia eventually sends their army to help squash this rebellion. And eventually they're able to force or sign this liberal constitution and send it along to Frederick William, who they name emperor of this new German state. But by the time that Frederick William gets this, he's already gained much of his power back, in large part due to this war with Denmark. And the ability to seize power whenever there's a war, you can just claim you're doing it for national security interests when you're just doing it in order to gain more power over your population. And so he rejects the constitutional title of emperor. He rejects the constitution that's created at this Frankfurt Assembly. But he does adopt some very conservative constitution. A few years down the line, Frederick William decides that he does want to be the emperor of Germany, and so he tries to get the other kings of Germany to vote him as emperor. But Austria, which is the strongest, at this time, the strongest German state, stronger than even Prussia, rejects this idea, and they call in Russia to help them put down this Prussian aspiration. And so what we see in these revolutions of 1848 is a real pattern where frustration boils over from voices not being heard. And that frustration leads to violent revolt. But because their frustration is just we aren't heard, there's no cohesive message. So the lower class and the middle class are aiming for different endpoints and thus never able to stay together long enough to effect a great change. Yes, some kings are overthrown, but they're simply replaced with another absolute ruler. And so eventually these revolutions of 1848, in the short term, are failures.